Chapter 7. The stories about the TARDIS were true, but the words bigger on the inside just don't do them justice. The vast room which greeted me looked like a mix of living matter and electronic components. A large circular console stood on a raised, rounded dais flanked by huge pillars that seemed to be made of a coral-like substance. The walls were a pure white, save for a few scorch marks here and there, with glowing inset roundels that bathed the room in a swathe of white light. The roof was a plain grey dome with wires and cables haphazardly hanging here and there, plugged into the slots on the central column of the console, or simply hanging loose from the ceiling. The Doctor was darting around the console, and for the first time, I was able to take him in fully. That face, impossibly old, when I'd seen him only a few years ago as a young man, but there was no mistaking those eyes, filled with guilt and regret, hundreds of years older than the face they inhabited. His clothes were odd too. The bandolier and gaiters he wore were very military in style. Even his blue velvet waistcoat with pocket watch chain had a certain uniform quality to it. But the grey, tattered scarf and battered leather jacket he wore over them made it seem like he'd dressed in something of a hurry, dashing out onto a cold battlefield, grabbing the first thing he could find. But then I could understand that. Even when I'd seen the fires of war burning with real intense heat, the cold touch of death never felt far off. The faint but still audible cries of Daleks echoing outside the door snapped me back to reality. I looked back, half expecting to see them right behind me, or at the very least a heavy, robust door that could keep them out. The sight that greeted me, however, was simply a set of white, wooden doors, almost identical except in colour to the exterior ones. The Doctor obviously noticed the look of mild worry on my face.
"Oh, they won't get in here. Besides, we're off,"
he said jovially. He pressed a button dramatically on the console, and when nothing happened, he gave it a swift kick, and the glass cylinder in the central column started to rise and fall with a familiar wheezing groan. As the harsh bellows of the Daleks faded away, I ran up to the console. What about everyone else on the ship? They're my family. They're all I have. We can't leave them. The Doctor bowed his head.
"I'm sorry. This won't be easy to watch."
He raised his eyes skyward, and the blank grey ceiling faded as if opening up to let the sky in, showing the freighter in orbit. Puzzled, I looked back at the Doctor, but he continued to watch towards the events ready to unfold. Looking back, I saw several Dalek saucers surround the freighter. I knew what was coming. I bowed my head and closed my eyes as I heard the boom and saw through my eyelids the bright burst. The freighter, and everyone aboard it, John, Alan, Alex. Once again, everyone I knew was gone. Thinking back on it now, I do feel sad at the loss, but at the time, I can only remember the burning hatred. For the second time in my life, the Daleks had taken everyone I loved from me, and now the only thing I had left was that hate. Hate, and the hope that several of those bronze bastards hadn't made it off the freighter. But I knew that wasn't the case. I opened my eyes as I felt a hand on my shoulder. The Doctor was next to me.
"That hate you're feeling, it's okay, I know it. But don't let it consume you. Otherwise you'd be no better than the Daleks."
We stood for a moment in silence before he turned back to the console and started flicking switches and dials.
"You can let this day define you, but remember who you are and where you come from, even if that place no longer exists."
He sighed deeply, and I sensed he was saying this as much for his own sake as mine. He met my gaze again.
"When you're the last, remember what keeps you going, what drives you. As long as you remember that, you will be okay."
With this last sentence, it almost felt as if the Doctor was still stood next to me, listening to his own advice. Advice that he knew he needed, or perhaps would in future. "Thank you," I said quietly. I stood for a moment, looking back up to the ceiling, almost hoping to see the freighter still gliding silently through the stars. But the ceiling was back to its blank grey once again. I walked up to the console and reached out to touch the panel in front of me. The doctor brushed past me and pushed several buttons on the panel before running back round to the other side. I stood back, leaning against one of the coral columns that stood around the edge of the dais. So, where are we going? The doctor looked up at me and raised an eyebrow.
We?
Despite the fact that he had been the one to lead me into the TARDIS, it seemed it had only just realised to him that he hadn't specified that this was a permanent arrangement.
We are going to the nearest spaceport. With Daleks nearby, there should be some refugee shuttles that can take you on board.
I drew myself up to my full height and folded my arms. And what makes you so sure that I want to leave? He glared at me, but it wasn't a glare of anger, more a glare of worry.
I travel alone,
he said. I backed down a little when I noticed the sadness in this statement. He might travel alone by choice, but this didn't seem like a decision he agreed with. I drew myself back up again, stood on the dais, and leaned over the console, mimicking his stance. Well then, I'm definitely staying. You've saved my life twice now, Doctor, and in my book that means I owe you. I'm not leaving until I repay that debt. The Doctor winced slightly when I mentioned his name.
I told you.
Yeah, I know, don't call you that, but whilst I'm around, that's who you are. He continued to glare at me. It was like a standoff of stubbornness. Then his old face crinkled, and his mouth twitched into a small grin.
Very well. Have it your way,
he said, pushing more buttons on the console, which caused the room to tip violently. The noise of the TARDIS louder than before, spiraling around me in the huge chamber. I clenched to the edge of the console tightly. Where are we going then? He darted around the console, twisting a lever on the panel next to me, and the room twisted in the opposite direction.
Home! Yours, to be more precise.
Doctor Who, Without Choice, Act 1, Survivor of the Daleks, was written and narrated by Jimmy Wolfe, with Dan Minus as the voice of the Daleks. The War Doctor's adventures will continue in Without Choice, Act 2, The Long Way Round, coming soon.